the official guide to the test. We go through every question on the test and not only give you the answers but also the explanations and show our work as we go through it, giving you a little bit of an extra leg up on how to tackle these problems. My name's Jim Jacobson. I'm one of the tutors for Grockit. And last time we left off in the middle of the reading comprehension section in the diagnostic test at the beginning of the book. So we are now on page 31 and question 12. And as before with reading comprehension, we do need to allow you a little bit of time to read the passage on your own, understand it to the best of your ability, and if you're interested, take some notes on it to help focus your thoughts on the passage. Make sure you don't go too far without realizing too late that you didn't really understand something you just read. So I'll be taking notes as I read, and while you read, and then afterwards we'll start tackling the questions. So I'll give you a few minutes to read the passage, and then we will get on to the questions. So start. Okay, If you're not done reading the passage, you can just pause the video if you like and catch up in a second. So oftentimes when you're taking notes, usually when you're taking notes, there'll be more than one paragraph with which you can divide up your notes in between the different sections. And in fact, that's one of the main uses of note-taking, knowing which thing takes place in which paragraph to speed your ability to find answers when you find things in the questions that refer you to particular concepts. In this particular case, we only have one paragraph. Nonetheless, I've written down some of the things that I thought were main ideas from the passage. Your mileage may vary, and to some extent, it doesn't matter that much what you write down from the passage. Anything that you don't write down, you can go back and look for. Anything that you do write down helps keep you focused on the passage. So even if the thing that you wrote down doesn't end up being useful in a particular question, it does still help you encode the topic of the passage in your brain a little bit more firmly, so you can move through the questions more quickly. So don't worry about what's right or what's wrong. Probably the only thing that's wrong to do is writing out complete sentences. As long as you're able to understand what you did with your notes, that's sufficient. No one else is going to see them. I've probably written out things a little bit more thoroughly than I would on the test on my own, because I do need all of you to understand what it was I was writing down. Also being more careful with my handwriting. I don't know if you can tell. But on the real test, of course, the only thing that matters is whether you know what you were doing. Anyway, let's move on to question 12. So the primary purpose of the passage is to, as always, it's best when you finish a passage to have a basic idea in your head of what the primary purpose is. You may not always get a main idea question, but it will help you eliminate wrong answer choices if you have that idea of what the author was trying to do with the passage. In particular, it's very useful to have a sense of whether the author was trying to convince you of something or simply explain something, because a lot of times wrong answer choices will use the wrong type of verb in those cases. So primary purpose of this one, now, of course, by the verbs on this one, all of them sound likely. We have explain, discuss, compare, discuss, and revise. So all of those are at least options. So we do need to read the answer choices in more depth. Choice A suggests that the main idea was to explain why women reformers of the progressive era failed to achieve their goals. Now, the passage does that. We find out about the progressive era in the first, 5, 6, 7 lines of the passage, all the way up to, I guess, line 10. So we go back and look there, and there we find out actually that although they didn't accomplish necessarily everything that they wanted, and that they were largely disenfranchised, which means excluded from the process, that it does say white middle-class women reformers won a variety of victories. So the idea in Choice A that they failed to achieve their goals is completely contrary. And in fact, the biggest goal, this one of the child labor laws, was a success, despite opposition from working class mothers. So everything about the passage is about a particular success that they had. Choice A cannot be the right one. Choice B, discuss the origins of child labor laws in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That didn't happen, at least not in the passage I read, and probably didn't in the one you did either. We don't have anything about the origins of child labor, which are to some extent probably as old as children themselves. So that's clearly outside the scope of the passage. Choice C, compare the living conditions of working class and middle class women in the progressive era. Now there is a little bit of a contrast between them, namely the latter half of the passage talks about how working class mothers of the time did face economic realities that the reformers, who tended to be more middle class, did not face. That said, the passage doesn't really talk about it that much, and it's certainly not the point, the primary purpose of the passage, so it can't be C. Choice D, discuss an oversight on the part of women reformers of the progressive era. This is a conclusion that the passage comes to over the course of the passage, namely that some historians now see this thing that women reformers of the time did not. So this is somewhat tempting. Everything else we've had so far hasn't really even been a correct detail from the passage, let alone the primary purpose. Let's check E. E, revise a traditional view of the role played by women reformers in enacting progressive era reforms. But we don't actually find the traditional view. We do find out that at the time they had this view that the working class mothers were poor parents. So that was the view that the reformers had, but so that was their traditional view, but we don't actually have in the passage a traditional view of the role played by women reformers. So this is actually outside the scope of the passage, leaving us with choice D, the one that we liked initially. So choice D is the correct one. On to question 13. So the word view, mentioned in line 17 of the passage refers to which of the following? Whenever you're given a citation like this, it is absolutely necessary for you to not only go back and read that sentence, but at least the sentence before and the sentence after, just to make sure you're understanding the context. So, line 13, 17. So we start before line 17. We have, ironically though, child labor legislation pitted women of different classes against one another. To the reformers, child labor and industrial homework were equally inhumane practices that should be outlawed, but, as a number of women historians have recently observed, working-class mothers did not always share this view. Given the precarious finances of working-class families and the necessity of pooling the wages of as many family members as possible, working-class families viewed the passage and enforcement of stringent labor statutes as a personal economic disaster and made strenuous efforts to circumvent child labor laws. So the view here mentioned is referring to something that happened before, or that's mentioned before in the passage. It says working class mothers did not always share this view. The demonstrative pronoun this can only refer to something in a narrative context like this, can only refer to something it renamed immediately after that in the same sentence, like with a colon, this view, namely that blah, blah, blah. Or it more typically is going to refer to something that's mentioned before. So the view mentioned just before that is the reformers' view that child labor and industrial homework were equally inhumane practices that should be outlawed. And working class mothers didn't share this, so we need something like that in the answer choices. So is the view that they did not share that some working class mothers' resistance to the enforcement, or is the view some working class mothers' resistance to the enforcement of child labor laws? No, that's not the view. That is actually the act of not sharing that view. So the working class mothers didn't share the view of the reformers, and so they resisted. So this thing in choice A is actually what comes after the word view and is not what it's referring to. Choice B, did working class mothers not share the view which was reformers' belief that child labor and industrial homework should be abolished? That actually sounds a lot like the words that came right before our word view, so this is definitely a tempting answer choice. Smiley face for the tempting one. Choice C, reformers' opinions about how working class families raised their children. So the idea of working class mothers as bad parents because they want their children to work even though they're little kids, does happen in the passage, but it happens later. So this is not a reform. It may well be actually a view that working class mothers would have not agreed with. The reformers say, well, you're bad parents, and the working class mothers say, well, no, we're not. But the view specifically mentioned in line 17 is the one that came before, namely that these two types of work should be outlawed, not about how they raise their children. So it's not choice C. Choice D, that certain women historians' observation that there was a lack of consensus between women of different classes on the issue of child labor and industrial homework, which is to say home at work, work at home. Well, it is unlikely that the working class mothers of the progressive era were actively disagreeing with historians who came as many as 100 years later. So, or at least actively so. So it's clearly not the view that they're disagreeing with. We needed the one that came right before it. And choice E, working class families' fears about the adverse consequences that child labor laws would have on their ability to earn an adequate living. So this is actually the view that working class mothers shared, that basically child labor laws were taking away an important source of income. Not, and the view is that they're disagreeing with is that the reformers' view that these things should be outlawed, so it's not choice E. Leaving us with choice B as the correct one. Okay, number 14. So the author of the passage mentions the observations of women historians, lines 15 to 17, most probably in order to. So in this particular case, we need to definitely go back and reread the actual section in question. The sorry. So lines 15 to 17, they mention that the number of women historians have recently observed working class mothers did not always share this view, basically the thing we just covered in the previous passage. And this is one of those cases where occasionally the GMAT will ask you something that goes back to some work you did in eliminating wrong answer choices on a previous question in reading comprehension. Obviously, it's only going to be reading comprehension because that's the only question type where you're asked several questions about the same passage, same basis. So, but sometimes this will happen. So thinking that you do can sometimes be recycled. In this particular case, the observations of women historians there are pointing back to, remember with the word view, are pointing back to the previous section. So we want something like that. So choice A was that the view of the women historians, or the observations of women historians, to provide support for an assertion made in the preceding sentence, lines 10 to 12. Which was, ironically, though, child labor legislation pitted women of different classes against one another. So this actually sounds pretty tempting. We should probably leave this as it is, or write this down as a tempting answer, because that is actually the statement of the historians does actually support or provide additional support or an expansion on this idea that different classes of women were disagreed. Choice B, raise a question that is answered in the last sentence of the passage. So the last sentence of the passage says, "This is not to dispute women reformers' perception of child labor as a terribly exploitative practice, but their understanding of child labor and their legislative solutions for ending it failed to take account of the economic needs of working class families." I don't see a question in that final sentence, so it really can't be choice B. There was no question raised, and that previous bit was not an answer to it. Is it to introduce an opinion that challenges a statement made in the first sentence of the passage? The first sentence, women's grassroots activism and their vision of a new civic consciousness lay at the heart of social reform in the United States throughout the Progressive Era, the period between the Depression of 1893 and America's entry into the Second World War. Well, there are some factual statements, unlike the previous answer choice where it alluded to a question that didn't exist. There are some statements in the initial sentence of the passage, but there's no challenging those particular statements about either the definition of the progressive era or the nature of women's grassroots activism. So it definitely can't be choice C. Choice D, offer an alternative view to the one attributed in the passage to working class mothers. So there is a view attributed to working class mothers, but that is by the reformers, namely that it's not really even a view, that they just thought that they were bad parents when it turns out that they may have had other reasons for supporting child labor laws. So we only have one view of working class mothers, so we're not changing that or giving a different attribution, an alternative view, anything like that. Last one. Point out a contradiction inherent in the traditional view of child labor reform as it is presented in the passage. We don't have a traditional view of child labor, so this one also cannot be it. Choice A, the original tempting one, does stay with us, and that is the correct answer. On to page 32. Question 15. The passage suggests that which of the following was a reason for the difference of opinion between working class mothers and women reformers on the issue of child labor. So the passage suggests, in the question stem, indicates that what we're dealing with is an inference, something that is not actually stated in the passage, but must be true based on what the passage says. If we accept the passage as true, this answer choice must also be true. Also note that with inference questions in reading comprehension in particular, a lot of times the answer will sound very like something that you thought you read. You didn't actually read it, you inferred it or the passage implied it as you read. So sometimes inference answers often have the air of being a little bit too easy, like, oh, that can't be right, that seems too obvious, that seemed to be actually in the passage. But if you go back and look, it's not actually stated the way it is in the inference answer choice. So we're looking for something relating to the difference of opinion between working class mothers and women reformers. We remember that the difference between them, women reformers thought that child labor was terrible and inhumane. Some working class mothers thought it was really nice to have the extra income and so that they could not starve to death. So we need something like that there's a difference of opinion in that regard. So choice A, reformers' belief that industrial home work was preferable to child labor outside the home. So this is a common wrong answer type on the GMAT, creating a distinction or a difference that's not present in the passage, but does include things that did actually get mentioned in the passage. We regularly heard in the passage about industrial home work as well as child labor outside the home. However, at no point does the passage actually differentiate the two, say one is worse than the other. They're always just listed together. So it can't be choice A. This is a false distinction, a false split in choice A. Choice B, reformers' belief that child labor laws should pertain to working conditions but not pay. Well, neither of these things are really talked about. I mean, working conditions were, of course, a factor in the decision, but this is one of those things where outside knowledge can actually hurt you. If you happen to know that working conditions for children were absolutely terrible and they also made very little money, that's great, but that's not what the passage is ultimately about, and that's not how you get points on GMAT generally. In this particular case, working conditions and pay, that type of distinction, also not at all present in the passage, let alone particularly pertaining to the different to the reformers and the working class mothers. Choice C, working class mothers' resentment at reformers' attempts to interfere with their parenting. This is closer sounding, so we can maybe keep this one around, because we do find out that working class mothers thought, or excuse me, the reformers thought working class mothers were bad parents. We don't actually exactly find out the working class mother's viewpoint on this, so this is not great, but that's sort of what happens. Choice D, working class mothers' belief that child labor was an inhumane practice. So this is 180-degree opposite. This is the reverse of what they actually thought. This is meant to catch people who didn't read very carefully. And then choice E, working class families need for every employable member of their family to earn money. So this actually sounds much more like it when we predicted what sorts of things would be the correct answer. We had the reformers believing that the practice was inhumane and working class mothers believing that it was essential to make the money. This is much closer to the source of the disagreement between them. So choice E is definitely better than choice C, which really we don't actually find anything out about resentment in the working class mothers or in their attempts to interfere with their parenting. the only thing the reformers were trying to do was end child labor, not interfere with the parenting. So we can get rid of C, even though it sounded tempting at first. Choice E is our correct one. Still on page 32. Number 16. That's an A. The author of the passage asserts which of the following about women reformers who tried to abolish child labor. So the author asserts indicates that what we're looking for is a detail actually mentioned in the passage. Unlike the inference questions where it's not actually listed, asserts or states in the passage, phrases like that indicate that we're looking for supporting details from the passage. So does the author assert that the reformers alienated working class mothers by attempting to enlist them in agitating for progressive causes? Well, alienation may have happened, possibly, but there's certainly no attempt to enlist them in the scope of the passage. So clearly, that's not it. Choice B, did the reformers underestimate the prevalence of child labor among the working classes? There's no information about that, how common or uncommon it was, let alone their estimation of or prediction of what that would have been. Were the reformers correct in their conviction that child labor was deplorable, but short-sighted about the impact of child labor legislation on working class families? This sounds a lot like what the author actually says. In fact, it's almost exactly what the author says in lines 28 to 29. Namely, this is not to dispute women reformers' perception of child labor as a terribly exploitative practice, but their understanding of child labor and their legislative solutions for ending it failed to take account of the economic needs of working class families. So basically, choice C is a restatement of something directly in the passage. So this is almost certainly the correct answer, but let's pretend this is the first question on the GMAT. We want to make sure we have identified with 100% certainty the correct answer, because it's always good to get off to a good start. Were the reformers aggressive in their attempts to enforce child labor legislation, but were unable to prevent working class families from circumventing them? Well, we do find out that that the working class mothers really went out of their way to try to get around the child labor laws. But we don't actually find out that they were unsuccessful in preventing. We don't find out that the reformers were unsuccessful in preventing it. So choice D is an inference that we can't actually make based on the passage. Choice E, they were prevented by their nearly total disenfranchisement from making significant progress in child labor reform. So we do find out that they're disenfranchised in the beginning of the passage. However, it's absolutely clear from the passage that they did enact child labor laws. So that's pretty significant progress, because we do find out then that working class mothers fought it along the way. So to say that they didn't make any progress, that is totally not something the author says. Choice E, the one that looked totally awesome when we were looking through it initially, turns out to be the correct answer. So we win again. Last one on this reading comprehension passage. Oops. Accidentally got rid of my word question there. All right, number 17. So according to the passage, one of the most striking achievements of white middle-class women reformers during the Progressive Era was... And here, so according to the passage, that phrase indicates that it's a detail from the passage, something actually stated, and almost the entire passage is about child labor laws. So that I predict that that's going to be so the answer would involve something along those lines. I could be wrong. It could be something else mentioned in the passage, but since the whole passage was about this child labor thing, I suspect that that's going to be the big one. So we have A, B, C, D, E. So was their striking achievement gaining the right to vote in school elections? Well, we actually find out that women in the Progressive Era were disenfranchised except for school elections, which implies that they actually already were able to take part in school elections. So it wasn't an achievement of theirs, and it's also just kind of a side thing mentioned. So even if it's something that they did achieve, that can't be it. Did they mobilize working class women in the fight against child labor? Well, if you've been following along so far, the answer is definitely not. That's more or less the reverse of what the passage is about. The passage is about how working class mothers fought the reformers rather than being enlisted in the fight. So that really can't be it. C. Uniting women of different classes in grassroots activism. Again, that's the reverse of what we had. We found out that they actually disagreed on this particular point. So that's another reverse one. Did they improve the economic conditions of working class families? That's another reverse one. In fact, the main point was that in taking away the ability of the children of the family to contribute to the family's outcome, working class families suffered as the result of child labor laws. I guess you could make an argument that it might have been better for the children, assuming they didn't starve to death, but of course that's far outside the scope of the passage. In any case, they definitely did not improve the economic conditions. Lastly, improving women and children's working conditions. So we do actually find out in line 8. Well, so it's 7 and 8. White middle-class women reformers won a variety of victories, notably in the improvement of working conditions, especially for women and children. So that's exactly what the passage says, and we're looking for something stated in the passage anyway, so there it is, choice E. That's the end of the reading comprehension section of the diagnostic test anyway. We'll come back to do more later in the official guide. Okay, so page 33, number 18. So with critical reasoning passages, one strategy that many people do is actually reading the question stem first. To get an idea of what it is that they might actually be looking for in the passage, so that because certain question types and certain question formats allow you to zero in on particular elements of the passage. Other people find it distracting to try to keep in mind the question that they've been asked while they're reading through the passage and comprehending it the first time. I personally tend to be more of a read the passage first and then read the question, similar to my approach with the reading comprehension. Understand the passage first, pay all of your attention to that, and then move through the question quickly. Your mileage may vary, but I'm just going to stick with what I'm most comfortable with. Maybe I have a small brain and it's all full, but I find it easier to concentrate on the question after the passage is already in my head. So number 18. Vasquez Morel Assurance specializes in insuring manufacturers. Whenever a policyholder makes a claims adjuster determines the amount that Vasquez Morel is obligated to pay. Vasquez Morel is cutting its staff of claims adjusters by 15%. To ensure that the company's ability to handle claims promptly is affected as little as possible by the staff cuts, consultants recommend that Vasquez Morel lay off those adjusters who now take longest, on average, to complete work on claims assigned to them. Okay. Which of the following, if true, most seriously calls into question the consultant's criterion for selecting the staff to be laid off? It's very important that you read the question stem very carefully. Very often on the GMAT, you will be given additional information about what aspect of the argument that you need to concentrate on. Sometimes it'll be something like, which of the following most weakens the conclusion above. Okay, that's great. But sometimes they actually will tell you specifically what thing you need to concentrate on. Here, we need to call into question the consultant's criterion for selecting the staff to be laid off. Since we understand the passage very well, that criterion was cutting people who take the longest on to do their claims adjustment work. So people who take longest are the ones going to be cut. We need to call into question that criterion. So, so we would need a reason why that would be a bad idea. Okay, so that's what we mean by call it into question. We need a reason why that would hurt the company, because they are trying to they have to cut its staff of claims adjusters by 15%, and they also need to handle claims as quickly as possible. Okay. So, choice A, if the time that Vasquez Morel takes to settle claims increases significantly, it could lose business to other insurers. So that's certainly possible. But if anything, their criterion about their criterion for the firing, that people cutting the people who take the longest, if anything, that should actually help with choice A. So by cutting out the slow people, basically, it should decrease the time it takes to process claims significantly. So choice A is, if anything, reinforces the idea that they should cut the slow people. Choice B, supervisors at Vasquez Morel tend to assign the most complex claims to the most capable adjusters. So here we're saying that the most complex ones, the ones that presumably involve the most thinking or work or something makes these more complex, those are assigned to the best people. If they're firing the people who take the longest, they might actually end up firing the people who end up with some of the most complex cases, because in theory those may take a while, because those are the tough ones. Those take the most work. So and if they assign their best people to the toughest cases, they may end up firing their best people along, if they use the consultant's criterion. So let's just kind of keep choice B out there as a kind of tempting one. That's a little smile. Well, it's a thick smile, but it's supposed to be a slight smile. Anyway, choice C. At Vasquez Morel, no insurance payments are made until a claims adjuster has reached a final determination on the claim. Timing is an issue on this question. The issue is that they need to handle claims as promptly as possible, despite the staff cuts. But the fact that payments aren't made until a claims adjuster has finished determination on the claim, that doesn't really change anything about how long it's taking them to process individual claims. So it's not choice C. D, there are no positions at Vasquez Morel to which staff currently employed as claims adjusters could be reassigned. Well, so this provides an alternate means of cutting the staff. But we're not actually here to question whether they should cut the staff or not versus reassigning them. So this one is basically weakening a different argument. This is why it's key to read very carefully the question stem. We are here to call into question the consultant's criterion, not the decision. So choice D is weakening a different question on this passage, if we had more than one. So this is meant to trap people who didn't read the question stem very carefully, but we're too smart for them. Choice E, the premiums that Vasquez Morel currently charges are no higher than those charged for similar coverage by competitors. What other people are doing is almost always outside the scope on critical reasoning passages. Things happening in other parts of the world or whatever, unless there's a direct comparison to a plan going into effect or something like that, what other people are doing usually is irrelevant. So the one that looked pretty good but was still we had to think about it a little bit. Choice B is clearly the winner. They run the risk of firing their best people under this plan if choice B is true, which would hinder their ability to process average and easy claims as quickly as possible despite the staffing cuts. Really, that's what having your best people around helps you do. So, choice B for number 18. 19. So number 19, prolonged spells of hot, dry weather at the end of the grape growing season typically reduce a vineyard's yield because the grapes stay relatively small. in years with such weather, wine producers can make only a relatively small quantity of wine from a given area of vineyards. Nonetheless, in regions where wine producers generally grow their own grapes, analysts expect a long, dry, hot spell late in the growing season to result in increased revenues for local wine producers. So which of the following, if true, does most to justify the analyst's expectation? And it's a good thing we read the question stem, so we need to worry specifically about the analyst's expectation, namely that despite this dry season, this hot dry season, which normally means smaller amounts of wine, they are expecting increased revenues. So we need a reason in our answer choices why, despite crappy weather, they're still going to make more money. More money is going to come in. That's what increased revenues mean. So, choice A, the lower a vineyard's yield, the less labor is required to harvest the grapes. So on the surface, this one can be sort of tempting because if they are not spending as much on labor, their expenses are down. It's a little bit suspicious, though, because this would affect their net profit, not necessarily the revenue. So I guess we'll leave the sort of uncertain face next to this one, but I really don't feel too good about this one. Choice B, long, hot, dry spells at the beginning of the grape growing season are rare, but they can have a devastating effect on a vineyard's yield. Well, if anything, this weakens the analysts' claim that they're going to increase revenue because it says they're not only going to have smaller grapes, but they're going to, have a devastating effect on the vineyard's yield. So this is an answer to a different question, namely how to weaken the analyst's expectation. Choice C, grapes grown for wine production are typically made into wine at or near the vineyard in which they were grown. So I suppose this is useful. It gives us this notion that transportation costs won't be a big factor, but that expenses don't really affect revenue per se. Revenue is just the money coming in before you subtract the expenses. Also, the location would be true whether they have this hot, dry weather or not. So this is really kind of outside the scope because it affects both cases equally, hot, dry weather and not hot, dry weather. D, when hot, dry spells are followed by heavy rains, the rains frequently destroy grape crops. Well, if we have heavy rains afterwards and we destroy our grape crops, is that going to explain why we have more revenue if we're the vineyards? No, it does not. So this is another one that actually weakens the analyst's claim. Can't be that one. Choice E, grapes that have matured in hot, dry weather make significantly better wine than ordinary grapes. Well, this is tempting. If it's significantly better wine, in theory, they could actually charge more, or even charging the same price, their wine may be in greater demand, they sell more of it, something like that. So choice E actually sounds better because it actually affects revenue. Choice A affected profit, which wasn't really what the question was asking. So on this one, we are going to choose choice E, and that is, in fact, the correct answer. Number 20, still on page 33. Well, I guess it's 33 to 34 because it goes on to the next page. My A's get more and more triangular as we go. So in the past, most children who went sledding in the winter snow in Verland used wooden sleds with runners and steering bars. 10 years ago, smooth plastic sleds became popular. They go faster than wooden sleds but are harder to steer and slow. The concern that plastic sleds are more dangerous is clearly borne out by the fact that the number of children injured while sledding was much higher last winter than it was 10 years ago. Which of the following, if true in Verland, most seriously undermines the force of the evidence cited? So again, we're given some extra pointers in the actual question stem. We're not just undermining the whole argument, we're specifically undermining the evidence. Here the evidence was that the number of children injured while sledding was much higher last winter than it was 10 years ago. So in order to weaken something like this is what's called a causal argument on the GMAT, where X causes Y. Here we're saying that plastic sleds have caused greater, that the greater number of injuries. Well, I guess it's not actually causal. This yes, it is. We're finding out that the statistic that the greater numbers are caused by plastic sleds being more dangerous. In order to undermine this causal argument that this rise in sledding injuries is caused by more dangerous sleds, we need to basically find another cause. There's some other reason why there are many more sledding injuries than there were 10 years ago. So, and this is actually a common issue on the quantitative side as well, dealing with actual numbers versus percentage issues. So if there's another reason why the numbers have gone up, it's not necessarily the case that that a higher percentage is actually higher percentage of sledders are actually getting injured. Anyway, page 34, choice A. Very few children still use traditional wooden sleds. Well, that's possibly tempting. If we figure that if more children are using the plastic sleds, then maybe that might increase the numbers. But we actually find out that the number of children injured while sledding was much higher last winter than it was 10 years ago. So there's nothing here to really suggest that the changing demographics of sled use are actually enough to account for the much higher statistic. We'll keep it, though, as an option. Choice B, very few children wear any kind of protective gear, such as helmets, while sledding. Well, that seems likely. Children are likely to do that sort of thing. However, this would apply equally to both the wooden sleds, the older, slower, more wooden sleds, and the newer plastic ones that are faster and supposedly more dangerous. So the lack of safety equipment should contribute equally to injuries regardless of what type of sled they use. Choice C. Plastic sleds can be used in a much wider variety of snow conditions than wooden sleds can. So in this one we have an argument for a greater usage of plastic sleds, much wider variety. So let's say there are 5 different types of snow. I don't even know if that's true, but let's just pretend. And you could only use the wooden sleds in 2 of them, and now you can use them in all 5 types of snow. That would contribute to more sledding incidents, more incidents of just sledding in general, and therefore greater potential for accidents. So this one definitely gives us an increase in the rate of usage without necessarily increasing the danger. Choice D. Most sledding injuries occur when a sled collides with a tree, a rock, or another sled. This is another one that applies to both. This is sledding injuries in general. It doesn't specify whether it's the wooden sleds or the other kind, so we can cross that one off. And choice E. Because the traditional wooden sleds can carry more than one rider, an accident involving a wooden sled can result in several children being injured. That may also be true. However, this is actually an argument for the wooden sleds being more dangerous. This would explain why wooden sled injuries might actually be higher, because there would be any given accident would result in more children being injured. We're not trying to weaken, we're not trying to make wooden sleds sound more dangerous. We're trying to make plastic sleds sound less dangerous. So it can't be choice E. Of the two, comparing them, choice A, we have a little bit of a difference then between, we have a few children still use traditional wooden sleds versus a dramatic increase in the usage, and it is in fact choice C. It's within the scope of the passage. It explains why the newer plastic sleds within the past 10 years have caused a much larger number of injuries. Okay. I think we have time for one more. Still page 34, number 21. So metal rings recently excavated from 7th century settlements in the western part of Mexico were made using the same metallurgical techniques as those used by Ecuadorian artisans before and during that period. These techniques are sufficiently complex to make their independent development in both areas unlikely. Since the people of these two areas were in cultural contact, archaeologists hypothesize that the metallurgical techniques used to make the rings found in Mexico were learned by Mexican artisans from Ecuadorian counterparts. Which of the following would be most useful to establish in order to evaluate the archaeologist's hypothesis? Again, a little bit of an extra pointer, pointing us towards what we need to what assumption we would need to make in order to help establish their hypothesis. Namely, that the rings that they found in Mexico were made by techniques learned by Mexican artisans from Ecuadorian counterparts. So in order to establish that, we need to find additional evidence to support, or find something else that refutes contradictory evidence that they found that those rings ended up in Mexico any other way than the Mexican artisans learning from Ecuadorian ones. So, choice A. Would it be useful to establish whether metal objects were traded from Ecuador to Western Mexico during the 7th century? This sounds pretty good, actually, because trade would be another reason that these metal rings could have ended up in Mexico. They could have been brought there already made, as opposed to having those techniques taught to Mexican artisans. This is another cause for those rings to be there, and so establishing whether they were traded or not would help a lot. Let's just double check the other answer choices, though. Choice B, whether travel between Western Mexico and Ecuador in the 7th century would have been primarily by land or by sea. This is another one of these false splits, a distinction that doesn't appear in the passage. We had some of these in the reading comprehension, even in this session today. And this is a distinction that is basically meaningless for the purposes of this argument. Whether they came by land or by sea, it doesn't matter. The issue is whether or not they were taught to do these metallurgical techniques. Not choice B. Choice C, whether artisans from Western Mexico could have learned complex metallurgical techniques from their Ecuadorian counterparts without actually leaving Western Mexico. At the risk of sounding uncaring, why do we care whether they had to go somewhere else to learn it or whether they learned it in Mexico? The question is whether the Mexican artisans learned it at all from their Ecuadorian counterparts. So if they traveled or not, it's as relevant as if the stuff got there by land or by sea, which is to say, not relevant at all. It's not choice C. Choice D, would it be helpful to know whether metal tools were used in the 7th century settlements in Western Mexico? Metal tools are completely outside the scope of the passage. We don't care about metal tools, we only care about metal rings. You can make metal rings without metal tools. Actually, I don't know that. That might not be true, but it seems likely. And on top of that, it is clearly outside the scope of the passage. Lastly, is it useful to determine whether any of the techniques used in the manufacture of the metal rings found in Western Mexico are still practiced among artisans in Ecuador today? Again, this is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what they can do today. We're talking about 7th century settlements, so this is, a much longer time ago. Whether they do it today has no impact on whether the Mexican artisans of the 7th century learned it from Ecuadorian counterparts or whether the rings were simply imported. That leaves us with choice A as our correct answer. So we'll stop there. We'll pick up tomorrow or in the next session, in case these aren't being broadcast every day in a row. Next session, we'll pick up with question 22 on page 34. My name is Jim Jacobson. You've been watching the Grockit OGTV GMAT edition.